This is Jim Cook with Embervane, and today we're going to talk about how to hear compression. I remember talking to mixing engineer Michael Brower at one point. He said that it took him years to be able to hear what compression was doing. And I found that this is not an uncommon experience amongst people who are working to produce music. So why is it so hard to understand? Well, I think it's because the nature of the word and how it works is not necessarily intuitive. So today, we're going to take a look at what compression is doing and how you can hear it, most importantly. This is not an in-depth guide on how to compress, but rather how to hear it. And hopefully that'll guide you in the future. And then you can look for other videos where we explain how to use the tools better. Let's jump into the DAW. Okay, here I am inside of Studio One. I happen to have a drum loop that has been repeated 3 times. For this example, we're going to take this drum loop and we're just going to listen to one specific drum hit. This one right here. And that's it. This is the snare drum. It's not necessarily an impressive snare drum, at least right now. All we needed was something to say, let's give us an example of how we're going to hear compression. Now, on each one of these tracks, what happened is the beginning one is going to be raw. Okay, and this one, I am going to add some compression. And on the next one, I am going to add more compression. Like, let's get some more compression there. Why? Because I want you to be able to hear the difference in what's happening with this. So we have our little snare. Done and ready to go. This blue one is the raw track. The next darker red is a little bit of compression. The bright red is more compression. What kind of compression are we adding? Well, in this case, I am going to use a Pulsar 1178. And this acts like an 1176 style or FET compressor. But the reason that I'm using this one is, outside of the fact that it has great controls and is an awesome plugin, it will show us what's actually happening. Check that out. Now that's nice. So what we are actually seeing here is, I'm going to draw this in over here, is that when we have a dip like this, it tends to correspond with a matching peak in the signal. This is where compression actually happens. And compression, which, by the way, from a word standpoint, sounds like the kind of thing that would make something smaller. Oh, it does in a technical sense, but that's not how we use it. The compression aspect is saying, can you do me a favor and take some of those big original peaks and can you lower them down for me? And now that would be compressing things. We are in fact squeezing and shrinking the range of the quietest and loudest part of that particular waveform. However, that is not necessarily what happens in the end. So in the end, we say, hey, do me a favor and take that now, that form that we had, and raise it up. And what it really does is it raises the volume of the lower volume stuff. Okay? Now that may seem a little weird. So let's get into an example where we are actually using it. Here's what I'm going to do to show you what's happening, at least from a meter standpoint. I have a meter that is colored blue. This is for this drum loop. And this guy is going to give us some data. And we're going to compare it directly to another meter, exactly the same setup, that is right below or after this Pulsar 1176, right, generic setup that we have, or rather our compressor that we have here. So what are we looking for here? I want you to pay attention to, when I play this, the Crest Factor here, and then I'll explain what that is. Check these numbers out. Okay, we're sitting in around 16-ish. We're sitting in around 19-something. Okay, so let's mark that down. First one, we were sitting in at loosely 19 or so, and then the next one was about 16. Now, what is Crest Factor? Crest Factor is nothing more than the peak minus the average of sound inside of a sample. And the reason we're measuring this one particular unit is that it happens to have a large peak, and then it comes down into a lower sound. So if I take the difference of this peak minus average, I get crest factor. Great. It's measured in decibels. That's cool. What are we going to do with it? Well, the crest factor is actually a measure of the transientness of a sound, as in how spiky, pokey, or dynamic is that sound. And what we can see with those numbers when they were showing our 19 and our 16 is that there's about 3 decibels of difference there. 3 decibels of difference. So that is taking the peak and saying, let's lower this thing by about 3 decibels compared to the average level of the sound. Now, here's the interesting part. When I play this again, I want you to watch these meters right here, and or this one right here, this digital one. And this is going to show us how much gain reduction we're actually getting. And you say, well, Jim, it says 5 decibels here. What the heck? Okay. When we have 5 decibels running, why aren't we seeing a 5 decibel difference in crest factor? Well, because sometimes not everything lines up exactly when we're talking about how we measure things. We're not looking at straight math here. We are looking at loudness math and peak math and average math, and depending on how you calculate it, that can get a little bit different. And these meters right here may not be reading in exactly the same way as what we're seeing on our crest factor, which is in decibels. You'll notice this says VU. That is a different kind of measurement. So don't worry so much about the numbers. Just know that with our measurement, we have about a 3 decibel crest reduction here. Now, I'm going to switch back and forth between these guys. And to do that, I'm going to move my meter up here so it's on the right now, compressed on the right. I'm going to keep looping, and I'm going to switch and see if you can hear a difference between these 2 sounds. Could you hear a difference? If you did, it was probably not necessarily in the poke of it, the hit, the impact, the transient, but rather was in the after effect of the sound. Let's listen one more time. Do you hear almost like a rustling in the leaves kind of thing going on here? That is compression taking up some of those softer sounds and pulling them up in relation to the peak. So even though it's pulling down the peak, it's raising everything back up. And I have these measured to the same loudness. How can you tell, Jim? Let's look. If I switch my meters on track 1 and track 2, the compression track, over to loudness, let's take a look at this integrated loudness as the loop plays. Notice 20.2, 20.4, it's actually quieter. So I have the more compressed one actually quieter, but it's only quieter by a fraction of a decibel, and that would be pretty hard for most people to hear. So let's listen once more to this difference, and then we're going to move into the more compressed version so we can compare these things against one another. One more time. Dash, 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 like that little sh sound going on. That is this compression taking hold. And the way I'm setting this up, where they're very equal loudness, this makes it so it can be harder to detect little differences. But if you listen to one of the sets, like the untouched set, for about 4 hits or so, and then jump, it tends to give your brain a good baseline to compare it to. And that's why I'm doing that. So let's move on to the more compressed version. And in this case, we are looking at this Pulsar. More compressed. Now we have this thing a little bit higher ratio. That just means that the hammer's hitting harder for anything that crosses the threshold, which is what we're seeing at the top. And we've got our meter right here. So red on the bottom is going to be our new one. And this one's on the top. Let me switch this back and let's look at the Crest Factor first and give it a couple plays. Okay, you can see maybe 2 or 3 decibels. It doesn't seem like there's all that much of a difference. Once again, we're not absolutely, destroying the thing. However, check this out. And this is another exercise that you can do, is look at the peak max of each one of these. If we can get the same loudness, which was that blue screen or the integrated LUFS, for a track or for a sound, and yet we have less peak down here, in this case, almost 2 decibels, that gives us what's called headroom. And more headroom is simply more room to do stuff. It gives you wiggle room to be able to make adjustments. That's a great thing. That is one of the ways that we can control these sounds. Now, for what we're doing right here, you'll notice that there wasn't a tremendous difference on this. And let's verify here that the loudness is in fact equal as well. Okay, 20.2, 20.3. Yeah, they're equal. So when I switch back and forth, even though they may sound different, they are actually the same loudness to our ear. So moving the meter, let's do the comparison right now. Now, did you hear the difference? That kush, kush going on in the back end is not really there on the raw version. I mean, it's there, but it's pretty darn quiet and doesn't get your attention. Whereas now it sounds like somebody's beating a drum with a big old, I don't know, pile of palm fronds or something. It's just like making that shushing sound that's going on. That is compression in action. And as we watch this, I'm just going to mute the output here. You know what? Let's see if I can solo this. Nope, you know what? I can't. So let's run this. You can see the amount of gain reduction, almost 9 decibels here. And what's happening? Pulling us up like this. What is that? Stop this. That happens to be the release of the compressor, something that we'll get into in another video. So with the way that the controls are set right now, we can hear a pretty marked difference between drums number 1 and the compressed version. All these softer elements have been brought up in volume in relation to the highest peak elements, the most sharp transient elements. So that's great for snare drum, and we've literally beat that drum enough. So why don't we move over into a vocal? So these are just some examples. I believe this was like a Ghost Hack sample pack that I have. So let's give a listen to the raw vocal phrase here. And once again, we have our meter, green being the regular vocal one. And then we're going to use purple for our let me get these back up. We're going to use purple for the compressed version, green for the uncompressed version, and then we're going to look at one where I said, what if I just went nuts and just put compressor to compressor to compressor on this thing? Like, what does that actually do? So right off the bat, here is the vocal we are working with.
Tell me why?
And when you hear this, one of the ways to listen to sound is to listen to the transient character on here. Listen to things that kind of poke out at you. In this case, to me, I'm hearing the w coming out at me, the wah, why, and it feels like, oh, I'm getting bopped in the face with a jab or something.
Tell me why? Tell me why?
Now, a compressor will in fact level that kind of stuff out, meaning that it's going to take those most pokey things and sort of bring them down in relation to everything else, kind of like averaging the sound out. So if we listen to the compressed version after this, and I'm going to bring up the compressor so you can see what it's doing. By the way, the reason it looks a little bit different here is just because it's a bass stereo track versus a mono track, even though all the signals are in mono. This is what you're going to be looking for right here. We can watch how much it's doing before I flip over. Also, notice, at least on the Crest Factor, what's going to happen here. This is a little harder to average out, but it'll give us a sense of things.
Tell me why? Tell me why?
We're looking at about 5 decibels of difference between the Crest Factor. We're looking at about 4 decibels of difference between the peak max on each one. So the peaks are being lowered down. And right here,
tell me why?
We are compressing, and quite a bit.
Tell me why?
Relatively speaking, about 10 decibels or so at a peak. Now remember, just because I'm using this in this particular way is to show you an example. It doesn't mean you should treat all your vocals like this. Keep that in mind. This is for demonstration purposes. We always want to dial things in for what honors the song. So let's get to the real stuff. Let's hear what this sounds like on the compressor. Twice through each time.
Tell me why? Tell me why? Tell me why? Tell me why?
Did you hear a difference? Let's go back one more time. Let's play them one at a time.
Tell me why? 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 Tell me why?
Did the second one, the compressed one, sound louder to you? Well, let's check the loudness. I'm going to switch over to our blue version on the awesome DP Meter 5 from TB Pro Audio. And let's compare the loudness of these two.
Tell me why? Tell me why? Tell me why? Tell me why?
All right, check this out. They're within 0.1 decibels of one another. So why does the second one sound like it is perhaps louder, more clear, grabs our attention more? Maybe it feels like the singer might be actually closer to us physically. Well, that is because the purpose of using a compressor and averaging, if you will, out this sound across the way, evening it, is to play with how our brain hears sounds. When we have a sound that has an average, louder volume, we pay more attention to it, period. Sure, some clap can happen off in the distance and can get our attention for a second, but it does not hold our attention. Our attention is held by things that are a louder average volume. And that's what compression is doing here with this vocal. Now, you might be thinking, well, if it sounds louder, do I even need it as loud in the mix? You may not. Not only may you have gained those 4 or so decibels of headroom from before, it may turn out that you can actually pull that thing down a little bit more, yet it still sounds clear as a bell. That is one of the awesome powers of compression. That's in another video. For this one, we're focusing on hearing it. I just want to give you little teasers of why this stuff is being used the way it is, because that's the next logical step. So, when you listen to these two, listen very specifically to the transients of the why. Instead of it being like, why? It's more like a why? And listen to the very end. Compare the very end when she's trailing off. What happens to that sound? Does it stay small and trail off, or does it have a change in volume? One more time through.
Tell me why? Tell me why? Tell me why? Tell me why?
Could you hear it at the end where it kind of swelled up a little bit? It's like, whoa, it took the quieter stuff and kind of boosted it. That's this compression and compressor in action. Now remember, this is not necessarily the one you would use for this exact situation. It's an example, but you could. So I want to show you now what happens when we really, really compress stuff. I ran one after another, 3 in a row, exactly the same. And what do we get on this one right here?
Tell me why? Tell me why?
If you listen to that right away, this is a great example of something that would be very compressed. It's not that it is absolutely smashed into a pancake, but it is quite compressed. Now, how can I tell by listening to this? Listen to the evenness of volume of the entire piece. Very few things are quiet related to something that would be loud. They're all almost the same volume.
Tell me why? Tell me why?
Real small little adjustments there compared to the beginning one.
Tell me why?
Big differences. So hopefully this has given you an example of like, wow, that is quite a difference in the sound. But what if we were able to look at it visually as well? I'd like to show you visually what's happening in the waveform with these compressors. Now that you've seen everything that has been at the same loudness and we've run through that, here is where we're going to make a little adjustment. All right, so I'm going to shrink down the stuff that's down on the bottom just a little bit and give us some room so we can zoom in on these tracks here, okay? And we're going to look at this one note right here. And we're just going to zoom in. And now this is not necessarily the easiest thing to see. And it would be great if we could overlay them. But I'm going to mark on top of these. And I want you to pay attention to a couple things. Notice how we have a swell that comes up. And then a swell over here. This is the general shape of how things look. On the next one, it does not swell as much, and then it kind of peaks up again. So notice the difference even right off the bat. Look at how this particular guy is kind of flat, whereas the first one has this ramp up that's going on. That is compression in action. In addition, the quieter pieces, things that you would have over here, are not as quiet on this end. Okay, that's great, Jim. Maybe you see it, maybe we don't. That's fine. Why don't we look at a vocal? Okay, let's do the same exact thing here. So I am going to zoom in, maybe not that much, a little bit. And just for the sake of this, I am going to increase the size of these waveforms just a touch. So here we are. Yeah, we can use this section right here. One example right off the bat is if we look at this part, we are literally touching what looks like very close to the top of our waveform. And yet, if we look at the crushed version on this, which should be very, very level, check this out. We aren't anywhere near the top. Look how much space we have right there. Holy cow. That is the bringing down of the louder parts. At the same time, when we look at a quieter part, like this one, which has this smaller section, we can see now here that it is much bigger. Much bigger. So what we end up with is, and I'm just going to zoom this guy out just a bit overall, is that now look at the difference between this quietest part. I know this green is not the ideal color for this right here. You know what? Let's switch to a magenta. Look at the difference in volume here and compare that to the difference in volume there. So The crushed version is a much more contained, leveled version. And think of how much headroom is available here from peak to our sound, right? Whereas there's very little up here. That's the purpose of compression. Hopefully this gave you a great example of how you can hear compression. And I encourage you to run some of these tests on your own. That DP Meter 5 happens to be a free meter from TB Pro Audio, which is just darn handy and very useful for stuff like this. Try to get things where you're matching the same kind of loudness and then compare it. How does it sound? Listen for things like the pokey spikiness of stuff. Listen for the soft sounds being brought up. And don't be afraid to zoom into a waveform. Just remember that you probably will need to kind of magnify what you're doing, maybe go a little overboard to hear this in the beginning. That's okay. That's how we identify it. It's like if I wanted to learn how to do a handstand, I have to kind of tip too far at some point to know where that balance point is. The same thing here. Don't be afraid to hit that compressor a little harder and be like, let me hear what this thing is doing and compare different sounds for yourself. Give yourself the grace of patience when learning this, but know that instead of needing to turn stuff down and try to listen to it in weird spots or only listen to drums, you can get a sense for how even the volume is across the entire passage, or how dynamic, meaning quiet, quiet parts, really loud, loud parts, a different part is. And hopefully that helps you out. Until the next time, take care. All right, that covers it for this video. If you got something out of it, drop a like, hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments what you'd like me to break down next. Now go make some music. I'll see you in the next one.